Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream event on the 3rd of May 2021. Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics here. Great to have you on this Tuesday evening. Very important conversation today. The RBA put the cash rate up and really some very important signs and changes in the weather. Timing is interesting, of course, with the election not far away, so watch this space. Anyway, just before I bring Steve in, I will just remind you, as normal, that we don't provide specific financial or legal advice on the channel. We do moderate the chat and the stream, so please just be careful around that. But also, do feel free to express your opinions and interact with each other. As at the 3rd of May 2022, if you want to ask a question, use that Walk the World to get our attention. You can obviously welcome to put other comments in, but if you put out Walk the World there's a greater chance I'll see it. I've also enabled Super Chat, which allows you to get your question top of the queue, or indeed make a contribution to what we do here, which would be great as well. And as somebody has said, timing is everything. Perfect evening for a conversation with Steve. This wasn't planned way ahead, but it just happens that the RBA moved today. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch across to Steve so that you can see that Steve is there. How are you doing, Steve?
Very well, mate. Good to be here. It's actually much, much better face-to-face. Now, Zoom is great if you're not in the same country, but if you're in the same city.
Well, it does allow us to have a bit more of an interaction, right? And there's so much we can talk about. So it's really difficult to know where. But let me just start. RBA lifted rates today, right? No surprise to most people,
That's right, yeah.
But what was your reaction?
Well, I mean, the whole idea that you control the economy, fine-tune with interest rates, is something that mainstream economists, who are now neoclassical, used to criticise their predecessors, who they called Keynesian, for saying, oh, you can't fine-tune an economy. Then what happened over time is the mainstream neoclassicals built what they call dynamic, stochastic, general, equilibrium models. And lo and behold, the main control mechanism inside there was the interest rate. So in their model world, which they think is the real world, then they can fine-tune this economy using interest rates. But the fallacy in it's always been that the model they use, which they used to, the one they call Keynesian, was actually from a guy called John Hicks. And Hicks wrote the model 1 year before Keynes published the general theory. It's a neoclassical model. And what he assumed was, and this is the beginning, very technical, but he built a model of an economy where there was a market for bread. And every week you'd have a new price being set for it. Couldn't get the model worked out, but his time period was one week. And then in that case, he said, well, in a week, expectations can't change. So you assume constant expectations. Now, what he realised later was, well, Keynes was talking about a year, okay? And over a year, you can't assume expectations are constant. Now, when you look at what actually causes people to invest, it's not discounting a known future stream of income. It's what your expectations are about future profit. And they have a model which they don't even know, because it's the ignorance of mainstream economists, even about themselves, still stuns me, that they've got a model which says you can only change the desire to invest by changing interest rate. That's if you know the future. Well, let's assume we know the future. That's typical neoclassical thinking. So in that sense, it's nonsense. What actually happens, and this is why I do expect some fireworks out of this, is that credit by banks creates money and creates additional demand. Okay? That's not in their models. I was literally the first person to work out the mathematics of that. They're not even in the same ballpark because conventional banks, economists leave banks and debt and money out of their thinking. So what happens is if you suppress the demand for credit by putting the rate of interest up, which you'll do in the housing market now, you can have a plunge. So what they see is a tiny fine-tuning 0.25% change probably won't have a huge amount of impact, but make it 0.5% or 0.75% or 1%, and I think you'd see an absolute plunge in credit demand, and that will cause a plunge in house prices, and that'll force them to reverse direction because, as you and I both know, the most important thing is to make sure Australian house prices keep on rising. So to me, it's a sign of just how they've dug themselves into a corner like a wombat digging backwards. They don't know what they're doing. They're in a corner, and now they're being forced to raise rates by their theory. But in reality, what actually causes inflation right now has got nothing to do with excess demand. It's the supply chain breakdown, and that this will do nothing. It may even cause prices to rise.
Right. So there's really some interesting observations there. One is if you've got supply chain disruptions around the world, messing with interest rates will have no direct impact at all, will it?
No, it's likely to put up costs as well, because you've got a huge number of firms who've got holding costs. They've got goods in shipping containers they can't take out. They're paying the costs that are involved in that, the financial costs, and you put the rates up, and they're going to say, well, the only thing we can do, we've got to cover that interest rate rise. So it's not going to be deflationary in the same sense that it was back in the 70s, when you had rampant aggregate demand as well as supply pressure back then from OPEC, and you had workers putting up wages. Wage demands are going up because workers had industrial muscle and there was real full employment at that point. So yes, you could take the sting out of the economy by putting up interest rates to really high levels. This time round, workers have got some power, mainly because of government spending, which is, again, they haven't factored into their thinking. So there is some demand pressure there. I'm not saying there isn't, but it's nothing like what they thought they were controlling back in the 70s, but that's still the mindset they've got.
And then, of course, the other thing is psychology, right? This is the first time in 10 years, 11 years, 12 years that rates started to go up, right? I'm already seeing in my surveys people throwing their hands up in horror. Oh, never thought this would happen, right? He said 2024 that rates were going to go up, right? Yeah. Now he's sort of brought it right the way forward. So as well as the broad economic landscape being incorrect, the psychological aspects and how the behavioural economics flows from that is, I think, also not in their models either.
Yeah, I mean, they do talk about expectations in their model, but the thing which people don't realise is they assume their expectations are correct. And this is, the insanity of this stuff. And I'm getting to the stage, I used to be, a bit critical of neoclassical economics. Now I think it's going to actually destroy capitalism. It's so bad. But the crazy assumptions they made included the assumption that people's expectations about the future are accurate. Now look at it right now, so as you said, just a matter of months ago, there's November, was the last time Low City couldn't see us putting up rates until 2024. Now they're going up in 2022. So it will mean people looking and think, in the past I took out a loan, don't worry, rates are going to fall. If I take a loan, what happens if they rise? Yep. And that whole uncertainty element, which of course again is left out of their thinking, that uncertainty element could really disturb things.
And I guess the other point there is that when people set out on a journey, they'll make an assumption about interest rates, but also they'll make an assumption about wages growth relative to cost of living, right? If you go to the early 2000s, actually wages grew quite strong, and that actually helped to support the growth of loans. But we're in a very different situation today.
Well, in Australia we are. It's actually quite strange. In America, the scale of increase in aggregate demand, because of government running a deficit, which they should do, the scale of deficit combined with the fact that you could no longer buy a whole range of different services, they plunged. And they're also feeding into this housing boom is global. All those elements there, and meant you had a working shortage as well. Again, COVID being part of it, if you lose workers, you have to have somebody on, you pay part-time wages, etc., etc. So there is that pressure on wages. But in Australia, it still seems pretty low. Well, we're seeing inflation said to be of the order of 5 or 6%, wage growth of the order of 2%. So you don't have that boost to aggregate demand from extra money, effective money from the workers.
So I guess the other point here is how much of this whole situation was created by reaction to the global financial crisis, taking interest rates really low, quantitative easing, flooding the economies around the world with lots of money, blowing up the debt bomb, creating money out of thin air. That's the underlying thing that we're really facing, aren't we?
I think this is actually a bit different.
Right.
Because quantitative easing definitely inflated asset prices.
Right.
That's why I've developed my Minsky software to be able to analyse where the financial flows go. And if quantitative easing, you're buying bonds of banks, but also non-bank financial institutions, and not just the shadow banks, but the whole pension fund system and so on.
Yep.
So when you do that, you take income-earning bonds out of their hands, at a profit to them probably, to the sellers, and giving them cash. And of course, as financial institutions, they're required to reinvest that cash. Well, they reinvest in the share market. So you get asset price inflation coming out of that, but you don't get a lot of demand in the real economy. Now, what happened with COVID was a complete shock to the system. The first time that we've actually had an exogenous shock of dominant scale to actually affect the economy, which is all their models, the fluctuations are only caused by exogenous shocks. huge shock. Government deficits hitting up to 30% of GDP, which they needed to do. But that means an enormous government creation of money, which then boosts demand. So that's what's come along. I would blame COVID, and I expect the ultimate breakdown of the globalised financial production system, and that will necessarily cause inflation, because one of the reasons costs are so low is the low wage labour all the way through, low environmental standards as well, all that sort of stuff. That was coming to an end to some extent in China. Now, if you've been to China, as I have a few times in recent years, I look at the living standard of the average person I see in a medium city, and I don't think you're any worse off than somebody in England, possibly better off. So the living standard effectively, and the food is definitely better, that to me implies that particular thing was gone. You still had your Vietnams and Cambodias and so on, they could move some of the production to, but that whole long trend was gone. Well, suddenly COVID's come along and gone smash in the middle of it, and as you no longer have that relocation, and now corporations themselves are starting to say, we can't rely upon a globalised supply chain. All the huge queues of containers you would have seen for Los Angeles and San Francisco are evidence that just doesn't work. And if you want to make a profit, and it's pretty hard to find an American capitalist who doesn't want to make a profit, you think, I've got to onshore, even though I don't want to. Right. So I think it's a huge change. And in terms of ecological things as well, frankly, we have to get away from globalised production. We have to go back to local and regionalised production. So I support that change, but it's going to be chaotic in the process, and cost will have to rise.
Right, and I suppose one of the observations is if you look at the average cost of food in most Western countries as a proportion of total income, it's been dropping down dramatically year after year after year after year, partly because of the globalised supply chains, partly because of industrialisation and efficiency. You're suggesting that may be turning around now?
Yeah, well, because, people talk about the Green Revolution. It wasn't the Green Revolution, it was a Brown Revolution. I think I keep on getting the name of the process wrong. It's called the Habitat process. I'm not a chemist. But the process that was designed to make superphosphate uses petroleum to make the superphosphate. So the incredible fertilisers that we've used to boost food production really were based on deploying fossil fuels, like virtually everything else humanity has done. Now, we're starting to run out of a whole range of essential elements. We're getting to the point we are actually literally exhausting some fundamentally irreplaceable elements in some cases, not just compounds, but actual elements. And that chain is going to break down. Now, I've seen estimates saying that if you didn't have the Brown Revolution, superphosphate, then the world's population's food production would have peaked at capable of supporting about 2 billion people. And we've got 8. So if we start to wear that, we've got either you need to go to incredibly efficient permaculture, something like the Netherlands has done, which is, again, very effective semi-industrial food production with minimal chemicals, but high productivity, that sort of thing. That's an enormous investment change. We can't do it as quickly as is necessary. And we're going to see, because of climate change, wipeouts for agricultural areas, plus wildcard, the thing I didn't have in my bingo sheet for 2022, Ukraine war. Yes. Ukraine is one of the world's major producers of wheat, and I think also corn, and Russia the same, and suddenly they're coming out. So food prices have to rise. And when that happens, one of the few things that I agree with Ricardo on is that the wage can't fall below the means of subsistence. And Bang are going to be putting wages up for that reason, just to be able to buy food.
So let me just turn the conversation slightly, because one of the things in Australia is we have a whole group of what I call working poor. So these are people who are in full-time work, right? But their take-home pay is insufficient to cover their cost of living and do the things they want to do. Now, is that a feature or a bug of the current system?
It's a feature. It's a feature which is self-destructive, but you can't talk capitalists out of self-destructive behaviour when they're making a buck. And I can't just say it's capitalist. This has also happened in previous social systems too. But one major unexpected discovery in my model of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis was that when you had rising levels of private debt, and in my mathematical models, I have the firms doing the borrowing money, not the workers. The people that pay for it, the social class that pays for it, is the workers. Okay? What you have is rising banker share, comes at the expense of falling workers' share, and that turns up in the empirical data as well as in my model. So what we've had, this inequality and the financialisation has come at the expense of the working class. Then also, of course, you had the just denostration of unions throughout the world. And I've plenty of economists I've had interactions with. They always thought that was a good thing. We need competitive labour markets. What that means is you've trashed the capacity of workers to bargain for a share of the productivity of the system. And now you've got a whole bunch of working poor who then make it very hard for anybody else to do anything different. So it's the sort of success which breeds failure, because capitalism grows when it's feasible to grow, out of increases in aggregate demand, which mainly come from working class salaries. And if you're crushing them, then you have declining. You don't have that growth of demand anymore, and you end up in a cul-de-sac. And capitalism both doesn't like cul-de-sacs, but also creates them.
And I know Matthias Cormann a few years ago.
Oh yeah, him. Yeah.
Yeah, it was actually said it's designed in the system. It's part of the way the system works.
Yeah.
Right? So low wages, it is not something that actually is just a happenstance.
Yeah.
It is actually deliberate.
And the conventional theory again says that's justified. There was what's called the marginal productivity theory of income distribution says workers earn their marginal product. So the wage for the average worker is the amount of product added by the last worker hired. That's the theory. And then the same thing for capitalists, they get the marginal product of capital. So if your wage falls, it's because you deserve it. Okay? Now, that is bollocks on every possible front, mathematically, logically, and empirically.
Yeah.
But in reality, wages are set by relative bargaining power. Now, if you've crushed the unions, and if you had high unemployment for the length of time we have, they've got no bargaining power, they get shit wages. And then you get to the situation we're in now, that they simply can't take a cut in wages anymore. But at the same time, they can't demand a rise. So it's an awful situation for a civilised society to find itself in.
And I guess the question then is, can society maintain civilization with that sort of disequilibrium?
Well, I think we saw a sample of what goes wrong with that with the Gilets jaunes back in France in 2019, a century or two ago. and what you had was Macron claiming to put a tax on for the sake of reducing diesel consumption as a green thing. In fact, it was trying to reduce his budget for the Maastricht Treaty's 3% of deficit rule for GDP, and by putting it up, it only affected. You live in Paris, you know what Paris is like. It's if you're urban rich, you either walk to work or you catch the subway, but you certainly don't have diesel. Yeah? So it hit the working class and the ones who've been turned into petty capitalists because they've been sacked from their trucking company and they've got their own trucking business and making a lousy return, put up the diesel prices. And as one of the protesters said, Macron's worried about the next 10 years. I'm worried about the next 10 days. And therefore they can't afford those costs and they riot. And that's what the French are great at riots. They're far better than in most other nations. But that tendency for political protest is going to come along now, because if you try to impose the costs of the increase in prices and the declining availability of goods on the working class, they're not going to be able to pay anymore. And like in the Anglo-Saxon countries, they're probably going to end up in homeless, and a fraction of them, and certainly depressed and running up debt and going off to payday loans and so on. In France, they'll burn a few more thousand cars.
Yeah, that's right. They have a particular style, the way they do things.
One of my great friends, Mark Lavoie, who's one of the leading post-Keynesian economists. Mark we worked in Canada and spent some time in Paris, and at a seminar in Paris, he was saying how he used to rail against the argument that the French are different when he was a French Canadian. And then he came over to Paris for several years, and he said, yes, the French are different. What other nation normally burns, quite literally, a few thousand cars get torched on their national day? The French are different. But the level of protest and political stuff going right backwards into the French Revolution, they will lead that protest. So I think Macron's going to have an interesting term.
Right. And one of the things you mentioned a little while ago, which I want to come back to, was population.
Yeah.
Right? The world global population is rising, although, of course, it's not rising uniformly. So in China, they've actually got a big demographic shift problem.
Yeah.
Japan's the same. Australia's a bit the same. But in other African countries, for example, population growth is pretty strong. And I guess the question is, are we at the point where the planet has got too many people relative to the size of the planet?
Yes, it is. We are an overshoot in every possible way.
Yeah.
And like I said, when you look at what's sustainable with food systems that don't use oil-based fertilizers, then we would have peaked out at about 2 billion. Now we're at 8.
Yeah.
And this is where I blame with a vengeance neoclassical economists, in particular William Nordhaus, winner of the fake Nobel Prize in 2018, because they encouraged us to ignore all this stuff and basically presume you can have exponential growth going on forever. As Kenneth Boulding, who was a rebel economist, came along and said, if somebody believes in exponential growth on a finite planet, they're either mad or an economist. And basically, being an economist drives you mad. Right. So yes, we have overshot. But it isn't just a case that we're increasing the temperature of the planet. We've overshot its capacity, and we have to face a decline. And that will have to mean a decline in population as well as a decline in living standards. The only way it's feasible to do that without the breakdown in society is if predominantly it's the rich who lose that, not the poor. The rich have to be the ones who both expenditure levels fall, and I mean inside nations as well as between nations. And I want less Cardassians.
But if you take the Davos mob, right?
Yeah. Who
are the rich predominantly, they'll say, well, we can innovate our way out of this. We are smart people, right? We've always found a way through.
Yeah.
But we're hitting so many limits now.
Well, this is actually you've got to have Simon Micho on your show one day. He's been a great mate, an Aussie minerals engineer now working out of the Geological Survey of Finland, who's done superb work, which is publicly accessible, on the extent to which we're overusing the mineral supply of the planet already, and then what is the possibility of maintaining current energy use levels for the production levels we do right now, and having the raw material throughput. And we have exhausted virtually everything that matters. There are some elements like iron we're never going to eliminate. The iron is the most plentiful element in the planet. So even assuming it'll take a lot of it's in the core, we're not going to run out of iron. But we are running out of, for example, of phosphorus. Now, neoclassical economists have got this stupid notion in their head of substitutability. If something gets used, you can substitute for something else. If you want to substitute for phosphorus, you've got to find yourself a new biology, because every movement I make like this is taking adenosine triphosphate and turning it into adenosine diphosphate plus movement. If we run out of phosphate, that's it. So, and crazily, we are actually hitting shortage levels there. Other elements, we're already pushing the availability of these minerals. And then if you want to go from an oil-based industry to a battery-based industry, there's nowhere near enough lithium to enable that to happen. So that we have real supply constraints of physical elements, not, as I said, not just compounds and things we can find a substitute compound for, elements you can't replace. And this, we've got ourselves here blinded by economists who have models where you can produce output using labour and capital alone.
Right. And does that mean then that the fundamental assumptions that governments are using for the way that they actually set up their economy and how they invest, the concept of the GDP growth, 2 to 3% every year, everywhere, and what politicians then think is normal and natural, all driven off that faulty doctrine, explains why we've actually got to where we got to.
We did, because if you look back at the great long march of history, it wasn't until about 1700 that you started getting rising populations. And if you watch a few shows like The Vikings, you get an idea as to why population constancy tended to be the rule. But the huge growth in population came when we started exploiting fossil fuels. And that's where Buckminster Fuller came up with a fantastic concept of energy slaves, and said rather than having human slaves, which we used to have, and then draft animals, and then when you go to machines, the slaves we have are energy slaves, coal predominantly, then oil, and that means that each of us is getting this enormous benefit out of using fossil fuels. But that's what's both depleting the fossil fuels. We can run out of oil, we'll never run out of coal before we destroy ourselves. But then we have the carbon dioxide feedback into the atmosphere, which we've known about for 150 years, that actually happens. And that plus also all the other pollution we're doing to the planet, we're totally stressing the planet's capacity to reproduce the life system. And that we've rushed into this, and again, mainstream economists, Nordhaus in particular, but also his colleagues in that whole, people like Richard Toll, Mendelssohn, I can name, although I know most of their names, they have led us here, and I want them on the firing line, not just the coal companies and the Koch brothers and so on.
Yep.
I want economists on the firing line for leading us into this trap.
And of course, economists and that economic thinking is also central bank thinking.
Unfortunately, yeah. I mean, the central banks are dominated by mainstream economists. I mean, you get some good people in central banks. I must say, I've got a lot of time for some of the staff in the Bank of England, and the Bundesbank. There are some decent intellects inside there. But frankly, a lot of the people who end up in central banks are those who couldn't cut it in academia, back when academia was a decent career. It's not anymore. So you get second-rate, third-rate neoclassical economists setting your economic policy. And what happens is they'll take a model of somebody like Sargent or Lucas or Wallace, and then they'll take what is a tiny model and very elaborately extend it to an enormously complicated model. And then they think the model's the real world. Now, they don't actually look back and see, well, the model to begin with, it was nonsense in the first place. Let's assume we know the future. And you can find quotes to that extent. And if I show people, they say, that's not what Samuelson said. I said, read the paper, read the words. This is the nonsense fantasy, because underlying the neoclassical vision is this wonderful idea of an anarchist society. Okay? It's anarchy because there's no power concentrations, there's no government, the market does everything, it's all fair. And that seduces these young minds into believing it's a perfect society, and completely ignoring the physical constraints of the planet on which we're on. And now we're reaching those constraints.
So that means that GDP target of 2% or 3% is wrong.
Yeah, I mean, we've got to go to degrowth.
Yes.
And the question is, can we have degrowth while maintaining societies?
Right.
That's really the issue for me, for the long term.
Yes.
I mean, for the moment, we're going to be stuck with this growth mentality, but give it a decade, if we're lucky, and it's going to be obvious that the system is falling apart. Productive system is falling apart. What we're doing, climate change, is going to hit our capacity for sedentary agriculture and wipe that out. One of my favourite terms from Nordhaus is saying how climate change will not affect 87% of the economy because it happens in carefully controlled environments. Now, the only thing that manufacturing, services, finance sector, the government, and so have in common is they happen under a roof. So what he's saying is a roof can protect you from climate change. Well, we're going to see plenty more roofs doing what roofs were doing in Germany, and that's flowing down rivers. And the same in Australia recently, because the scale of the storms we're talking about are going to disturb the sedentary foundation of human civilization. And that's what, when people realise that's what's happening, then we'll start taking climate change seriously. And I'm expecting to see them saying, why didn't you scientists warn us well enough? They'll blame the people who are trying to raise the alarm for the last 40 years rather than the economists who led them up the garden path.
Right. And of course, there was a report that came out, I think, the last couple of days saying 20% of properties in Australia will be uninsurable quite soon because of climate change.
Oh yeah, they're obviously exposed, like we saw for Lismore, for example.
Yep.
I mean, even Bondi. When I saw Bondi being underwater, waves coming over and crashing onto the parapet there, that was Manly, the Corso below water. It's 3 feet above. It's 3 meters above sea level, and the ocean's 50 meters away, and it's underwater. So the scale of storms we're talking about, and this is the scariest thing, and this is why I want to get this into people's minds, because it might not happen, but it's what could happen. And rather than saying, let's just assume the best possible outcome, what could happen? A guy called, I think it's Philip Anderson, who is professor of chemistry at Harvard University, so he's obviously a total oddball and nutcase. The guy who identified the ozone hole in the ozone layer, his argument, which is not supported by everybody, he's got quite a few who criticise him for it, his argument was when the Arctic sea ice disappears during summer, that will dramatically increase the temperature of the Arctic. I mean, we break down the 3 circulation systems that currently give us the 0 to 30, 30 to 60, 60 to 90 division of the atmosphere, and turn the stratosphere from a dry stratosphere, which it is now, to a wet stratosphere. Now, his punchline on that, which is scary as hell, is that with the water will come chlorine and bromide. And when they get into the stratosphere, they will destroy the ozone layer. Now, again, it's a question of magnitude. He puts across that it'll be elimination of the ozone layer. It won't necessarily be that, but it could be. And that would mean it'd be impossible for life forms to survive in the open. goodbye agriculture, goodbye being outdoors, goodbye food. So those are the sorts of things we're playing with, as if it's a question of optimising, and we don't want to spend too much on climate change because we might damage GDP too much, which is the mentality of Labor and Liberal here.
And I was going to sort of come on to the conversation point, which is, the conversation we've just had, the last 30 minutes or so, is not a conversation that is being had in any of the political conversations around the place, right?
No, that's why I'm standing for Parliament.
Yeah, you're right. Great, I'm glad you are, vote for Steve King. The interesting thing, though, is this is all very big, scary stuff. And so people will turn around and say, come on, you're over-egging the cake.
Exactly. Keen's just like house prices. Keen's going to be wrong. Okay, I can see that.
Yeah. So how do you deal with that?
Well, two ways. One is you just basically wear it. I've got a pretty thick skin after the last 15 years. The second is try to get things done, which mean that when this catastrophe hits, there are structures in place to enable us to cope. So I'm working with a group in the UK who are working on a scheme for a parallel price system, where as well as paying the money price for something, you pay the carbon price for something. So like if all goods would have two prices. You pay in money, you'd pay in carbon. You get a universal carbon credit, and we could actually set that at the average for an entire country, which would mean 95% of the population would not be affected. They have excess carbon credits. They can sell it to the 5% who are, which of course the Bill Gateses of the world and anybody who's flying a private jet would exhaust their daily quota in minutes and have to buy off the poor, and you get a redistribution system back to the poor again. We will need something for rationing. I think that's inevitable. So I want it in place before it hits. So I'm going to, for example, if I got into Parliament, and this is flagging to I can wait, if I actually do succeed, I can just wait for the first Liberal Party senator to throw this one at me. Matt Canavan's obviously a case, is that I want to have a system for carbon rationing in the future. Yeah. And then if we don't have it, we can't bring it into place in the sort of breakdown we're going to go into. Whereas in the Second World War, of course, when that began, ration cards became common. And they were accepted by the population because you knew you had to constrain your own consumption to enable as much as possible to go into the war effort. And that was a shared mentality in America, and particularly the UK, of course. That's not going to happen on climate change. It'll be too disturbing, too weird, and you can't put a funny mustache on the person who's causing it. So it won't be anything like the same focus that we had back then. We need structures in place before that happens. So the main thing I'm going to go is, okay, throw your bricks at me. I want a central bank digital currency.
Right. Well, let's go there then. Central bank digital currency. Let's be clear about your definition firstly, and then why the central bank digital currency is so important.
Well, for me, central bank digital currency is a way that you could use as a conduit for normal government funding to put money in people's bank accounts. So, for example, you and I were both here in 2008 when Rudd did the $1,000 per taxpayer. I hadn't done my tax in time, so I didn't get the $1,000. But anybody done their tax at that point got a tax rebate. I think it was $960, which they then spent on flat TV screens at Harvey Norman. Okay. No. Now, when I went to the UK, not long after 2014, I found that most people don't have a tax account. And so there wasn't that system in place. And when I spoke to people in the bureaucracy, they said it would take 6 months to a year at least to bring in a system where you can make a cash injection to people directly. Now, if we all had an account at the central bank, okay, which could be initially in the same currency as the actual currency, and not the carbon rationing I'm talking about, but a straight account, that could be the conduit. So rather than getting a government stimulus package put in through your personal bank account, it could go through your central bank account, and then it could be controlled for different purposes at various times. By the way, I'm not a fan of abolishing money. In case, I think the last thing I want to do is have physical notes abolished by people who don't understand money to begin with. Right. So I want notes to continue existing. But I'd like to see that there's an additional way, another way for the government interface with the private sector. But ultimately, it's an interface whose purpose could be changed when it's needed, and it will be needed.
And that means you don't need retail banks, right? Because you basically have the central bank now putting money directly into people's accounts.
Feasibly, yeah. I mean, and you can pay tax that way as well.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the reason that the UK, which was looking at it, Bank of England was looking at central bank digital currencies, didn't do that because the damage that would do to the retail business of the banking sector. So you have got that issue, and like a large part of what the private banks actually do is they're the conduit for government money creation.
Yep.
And so if you then have the central bank providing those accounts instead, then the transaction system can be or the credit system doesn't create the transaction system anymore. Now, I actually want to make banks much less powerful. You know the 363 rule? Okay. Borrow at 3. It's not really true to say it's borrowing, but borrow at 3, lend at 6, and be on the golf course by 3. That's what we need bankers to do.
Yep.
So I wouldn't at all mind reducing the importance of the banks. They're off their minds in thinking how important they are these days. This delusional masters of the universe. I want to make them, masters of the playpen. Right. And masters of the golf course, maybe. And so anything which reduces their status to me is not a bad idea.
Right. So what you're really saying is there's a role for banks, but it's not the role we've currently got.
No.
They've morphed into something like a giant monster, driving everything and actually making huge profits on the back of it.
Yeah.
And you touched on money creation. Let's just replay the money creation part of the story because some people still don't get it.
I know, most people don't get it. And because I've been working with my Minsky software for so long, and I really would advise people to download it, play with it themselves and see what I'm talking about. What you realise that it's assets minus liabilities equals equity, the fundamental accounting equation. And banks are basically machines, accounting machines. So they have assets on the one side, which is loans or reserves or bonds, which they own. And on the other side, they have liabilities, which are predominantly deposits for the private sector. Now, the deposits are by far the major source of money. So if you want to increase the amount of money, you've got to increase deposits in the aggregate, which means you have to make bank liabilities rise. Well, that means you've got to also do something that makes bank assets rise. If something is assets, liabilities go up and go down, nothing happens. And that's mainstream economic theory. Bullshit of the loanable phones model, the idiots still pump out, 8 years after the Bank of England said it's nonsense. That's what the idiots are still teaching. So what can increase liabilities to the banks and assets of the banks at the same time? Fundamentally two operations. Banks create loans, their loans go up and their deposits go up, okay? Or the government runs a deficit and the deposits go up and the reserves go up. And that's the fundamental mechanism for money creation, those two. Exports also come into it, which is where I differ from modern monetary theory, because they ignore that issue or they distort it with another. I think they've got an idea about exports and imports which contradicts their ideas about money. Okay? But the basic thing, if you have an export surplus, you are forcing your central bank to convert the foreign exchange you get into domestic currency. So those are the three main ways. But fundamentally, you can bring it down to saying at the global level, it's banks creating loans or the government's running deficits. So that's how you create money. And the thing, if you create money using loans, then you necessarily drive the non-bank private sector into negative equity. Simple reason for that is, to be a bank, you must have positive equity. So you look at the banking sector and compare it to the rest of the world. If the banking sector is in positive equity, as it must be, then the aggregate of the rest is necessarily a negative equity. And that means if the government tries to say in positive equity itself, it pushes the non-bank, non-government private sector into negative equity. Now, what do we do with that? Nobody likes being a negative equity. We respond to it by going and borrowing money from the banks and gambling on asset prices. And that partly is the whole madness you and I have been driven crazy by for the last 25 years, of people focusing on asset price inflation and not looking at real goods and services. And the banks themselves, they wouldn't know an industry if they fell over it now. So what they do instead is bricks and mortar. They've dumbed themselves down and made a fortune doing it. I want banks to behave like Schumpeter thought banks behaved, and that is providing money for working capital for corporations, some credit for consumers with some items you can't buy out of cash, and funding for entrepreneurs, which they don't do right now. So that's the legitimate role. That means a much smaller banking sector and a much smarter one. And we have got neither at the moment. We've got a fat, stupid banking sector.
It's certainly a very large proportion of the economy. And if you look at the proportion of loans that they now make for housing lending compared with business lending, it's gone like that, and business lending's gone like that, right?
And you've got all this nonsense, government debt's too high, blah, blah, blah. In Australia, it's under 60% of GDP, and household debt's 120%.
Yep.
Corporate debt's about 80% of GDP. So, and fundamentally, the increase in household debt began when they'd saturated the corporate sector. Yep. Household debt in Australia back in the 60s was about 20% of GDP. And I remember doing the numbers in the 2000, the run-up to the financial crisis, having the expectation that the increased lending to the household sector would have come a few years after the 1990s recession, because that was back when you're lending to Christopher Skase and Alan Bond, huge increase in corporate debt, all the greed is good nonsense of coming out as well, and leverage buyouts and so on. And then you got saturated private corporate debt, and that's been fluctuating ever since. But I thought, that crisis would have occurred, and then for a while there have been less lending, and then after a while they might have discovered the housing sector. No, what I found was as soon as the corporate level of debt topped out and started to fall over, they started lending to the housing sector. And it's just banks profit by creating debt. And if you don't constrain them, they'll create too much debt, but they've got to fool you into it. Now, you can fool corporates in for a while, but you reach saturation and the Drexel days are over. But the household sector, if you borrow money, don't worry, your house price is going to rise. And we got on this, they call it in systems dynamics a positive, I call it an amplifying feedback, more debt, more house price, more debt, more house price. You get to a point where it can't go any further. And we've already hit that for Australia. We've hit about 120%, now it's starting to fall down. And of course, what are Labor and Liberal doing? Policies that are going to encourage you to borrow more money.
Right. Well, let's go straight on to those, right? Because, we're starting now to get into the meaty discussion about housing affordability. And, the first observation, you got to look at the debt issue. You can't solve this without looking at the debt issue, can you?
Yeah. Well, if you could, you can, because he knows everything, and their assets are worth more than their liabilities, so it doesn't matter. Yeah. But when you look at it, what actually drives house prices is rising levels of new mortgage debt. Yep. This is an argument I first developed back in the early 2000s, and it's a simple argument. Let's accept that yes, housing supply is rigid. Okay. Therefore, most of the factor that causes change in prices is going to come on the demand side. Yep. Now, where does the demand come from? Not from cash, it comes from borrowed money. So most of the monetary demand for houses is new mortgages, which is the change in mortgage debt. So the new mortgages are going to set you a price level. Therefore, the change in the new mortgages sets the change in the price level. So you've got a second order, two derivatives. You have the debt level, the rate of change of debt, and then the rate of change of the rate of change of debt. And at that point, the human mind starts to fail, I've found. And then the rate of change of house prices. Yes. So I can take the data for America and show this pattern of rising debt and then falling, and then rising house prices falling and rising. And then you show Australian, and you've got rising household prices and rising household debt. Looks like two different patterns. You do the second derivative thing for debt and the first derivative for house prices, and you find they're correlated almost precisely the same degree, about correlation coefficient of about 0.6. And this is not a correlation causation. This is a causal argument. And when we've done, in a very amateur way, the causal argument, it's predominantly change in house price, change in new mortgage debt drives change in house prices. So it's a classic case of a deadly amplifying feedback loop, and we should be trying to find ways to dampen it, not encourage it further.
Right, well, let's talk about encouraging it further, because both sides of politics in this election campaign, Labor at the weekend, have further amplifying strategies, right?
Yeah, 40%, the government buys 40%, you buy 60%. Yep. What they're going to slowly reduce the amount you borrow, but increase the amount of debt for that amount as well. So it means and then the government, and you see this is actually written in the Labor policy, the government is expecting to make a profit, which means they're relying upon more rising house prices. All these poor renters looking at an impossible thing to get into. That's where the 40% fall in the government providing 40% means your deposit's going to fall for that reason. But if the price start rising, we're back in the same bloody situation again. And it's just insanity. And it wasn't Einstein who said it, but doing the same thing, pumping up demand, giving money to first-time buyers, giving money to investors, and expecting the situation to improve, it's going to make it worse.
So Albo denied emphatically in an interview the other day that they would have any positive impact in rising house prices.
Bullshit. Pardon me, that's an unparliamentary term, isn't it? Buffhead. Sorry, Albo, but on that you're a buffhead.
But of course, the other side also have slightly different but same sort of
policy,
pulling more people in, right?
Yeah.
So essentially, it is a Ponzi scheme insofar that the only way it can continue to work is to pull more people in the bottom and bring it forward.
Yeah, and whenever it starts to fall over, you do something to try to drag more of those renters into it. But that's why my policy document, which you'll find on my keenforthesenate.com website, starts with housing tenure. And I used to say when I was talking about the financial crisis to my students before it happened. I said, I wouldn't dare make up the numbers that I download from the Federal Reserve's website. Okay? And the same thing applies here. When you look at the percentage of people who own their own home outright, it used to be 40%. It's now down to about 30%. That's from 1998 to 2018. So, not the whole span, only half the span of these monster policies. Falling home ownership, rising percentage in mortgage debt, rising percentage renting. The objective of these policies was always to increase home ownership. It has done the exact opposite. So it's time to try the exact opposite policy. We have to reduce house prices.
Absolutely, and I'd underscore that policy document, which is brilliant.
Thank you.
And
some of the others won't agree. Labor and Liberal will have a go at me. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, well, yeah, but it goes back to this philosophical starting point, right?
Yeah.
If you start from the wrong place, you end up with the wrong answer.
Exactly.
Right? If you assume that it's all about supply side and helping more people to get in, it sounds good politically speaking.
Yeah.
Right? And of course, this is all about winning the election, not actually winning policy. But it actually doesn't solve the problem. Right?
And it's also using a good power of government for bad reasons.
Yes.
Because, again, the government can only do this because the government creates money. Now, they've got this myth about the government borrowing money.
Yep.
But what they're doing is using the government money creation power to maintain a Ponzi scheme. I'd rather use the government money creation power for decent infrastructure, decent education, decent healthcare. And that's a good reason to run a deficit. We're running a deficit to inflate asset prices.
Right. And so another way of putting that, we've got $1 trillion of debt, right, due to bad government policy over the last few years. What have we got for it? Right?
Yeah.
What could we have got for it if we'd actually invested in the right things?
Yeah, I mean, and this is again, talking about, as we were earlier, about the need to onshore production once more.
Yes.
We need engineers. We need people who understand technology. We need a high level of education, not the garbage that comes out of university these days.
Yep.
We need to fund that. And that means going back to the sort of building a society attitude rather than the bean counting argument that dominates these days. And so that's what you should be doing, funding decent universities, meaning you only get in university if you get a high mark, you don't pay any fees, but you'll fail if you don't do well enough. The right technology, funding companies to actually develop technology, infrastructure for green infrastructure, we need that in a radical way right now, all that sort of stuff, which is the exact opposite of what this mob have been doing.
And what's interesting is that the quality of the political debate, right? Well, there isn't much, right?
Sorry, I think oxymoron is a good way to start a sentence.
Yeah. Exactly right. No, it's almost like these big policy issues, we're talking about, just never get a look in.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm not sure whether it's because they don't get it, or whether they're too frightened, or whether it's because the two big parties don't want to be seen to be separate. Because
it's a whole lot of stuff. I mean, the tribalism is a large part of it. I went to university with some of the previous mob, like Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull, turned up at Sydney University shortly, a few years after I began there, but they overlap with them. And I think I told you in my favourite line about the two. One thought he knew the word of God and the other thought he was God. Okay? But what you get is this juvenile politics right from the very outset. And it doesn't matter what you do, it matters that you win. Yeah. That tribalism. Yep. You look at people like, the ones that come through from all that stuff, the Michelle Cash, whatever her name is. I mean, I've saw those sorts of aggro faces over student representative councils back in my teens and 20s, and they're now turning up in Parliament, and they really haven't realised they've changed places. They've still got that tribalism. Winning matters more than anything else, and you don't want to do anything which can expose you to ridicule. And of course, because we've got all this mainstream belief about house prices have to rise, comparative advantage is better than autarky, all this nonsense they learn out of first-year economics textbooks. That still sets the debate parameters, and they don't want to be ridiculed. So we're trapped in a conventional wisdom as well as trapped in tribalism. And that's a major reason why TNL was formed, to break those down, because this has led to the level of corruption we now see. Now, that's off the scale. I mean, I never thought I'd see the scale we're seeing now, but it's been built into the system by the tribalism. Yeah. And talking about built into the system, what's the role of the mainstream media and how they interact with this? Well, unfortunately, the mainstream media has declined radically over time. I had a little fight with the Guardian, as it happens, because some Guardian journalist, Greg Jericho, is now working for, I think, the Australia Institute, disparaged Don't Look Up. And as somebody who's who now caught up in the climate debate, that really hit home. And like a lot of scientists said, that's our life out there. And he said, I got bored with the 40-minute mark. And I said, well, that's it. I'm not going to bother supporting The Guardian anymore. Not because I was being angry at that, but really there's no point supporting the mainstream media. Yep. The decline in the quality of the media in the last 40 years is incredible. And again, you have to be my age, our age, to be aware of that. Back when in the 60s and 70s, there used to be research units, decent libraries at the... And so somebody who is a journalist would be able to go to see the research staff to ask a question, get some backup, maybe find something different about it. Now it's basically stenographers. Well, there are some good journalists out there still, but people like Michael West, they're too expensive, they chuck them out. The good journalists have to become independent. So the mainstream media really is like a set of pumping out press releases. And of course we have Rupert. And also we've got Costello now dominating the Sydney Morning Herald. So the calibre has fallen dramatically. And at the same time, the Liberals have crushed the ABC with this so-called efficiency dividend, expecting a 1.5% increase in productivity per year, which is garbage, just a way of saying we're going to cut your budget by 1.5% per year. So all the support staff that used to exist there, that's gone. So it's been trivialised. I feel sorry for them, frankly. But it means that consequently you don't have good journalists and you don't have pushback that you used to get out of the Alan Ramseys of the world. And therefore it's juvenile press release stuff that dominates. And, again, we get too many Kardashians out of it.
Yeah, and also you have these staged events where, the Prime Minister in a jacket.
Prime Minister doing some welding. Jesus Christ. That garbage being media, I'd rather watch Cats on YouTube.
Yes. Well, they're certainly more educational, I think.
Yeah.
But what I find interesting is that there's very little observation of this, elsewhere about just how weak and stupid this is.
Yeah.
It just seems to be this is the way it is. And if you look in other countries, it's the same.
It is the same. But really I blame the media for that because they never worked out how to handle the internet.
Right.
Back in the days when you bought the Sydney Morning Herald, it was 2, possibly 3 folios, even on a weekday. And on the weekend, you needed a truck to bring it back home. Yeah. And of course, that had the rivers of gold of the classified ads, and that's where they got most of their money. Along comes the internet, and that undermines them. They've never worked out an alternative micropayment system where you can read a few articles. Like I used to subscribe to The Guardian. I do still to the Sydney Morning Herald and the New York Times. Yeah. If a good article comes to the Washington Post, I click on it and I get, do your subscription here. Yes. I'm not going to subscribe to the Washington Post for one article, but if they had a micropayment system, it could work, and they never worked it out. Now, there's a firm called Inkl. You may have heard of them, INKL, Australian. I still support them. But they do the aggregation, and then based on what you read, they pass that money back to the newspapers they're getting the material from. But the newspapers haven't got behind that either. So in terms of stupid capitalists, you can't go past the newspaper sector. They never fundamentally realised the threat the internet made to the rivers of gold, and they've never worked out an alternative funding system. And that's why they've declined so much. And society has suffered as a result.
Absolutely.
Because if we had the type of journalism we had back in the 70s, and partly the 80s, then we could have exposed a lot of this garbage and we wouldn't be ending up in the corrupt miasma we're in now.
Yeah, it is interesting. And talking about corrupt miasmas, carbon tax, right? In fact, Jason, a little while ago, and Jason, thanks for the super chat, asked, do you agree with the carbon tax and that we used to have and it got cancelled, Was that a thing going in the right direction or not going in the right direction?
Not really, because again, it's seeing the whole thing as getting price. Get the price right. The price is right and everything will happen.
Yep.
This is bloody Nordhaus again. So he distorted the whole thing. If you read The Limits to Growth, which I highly recommend people to read, and look at the model as well, that was saying we have to physically reduce our resource consumption and bring a whole range of limits on population, on the use of fossil fuels right back in 1972. Now, instead, what he says, no, it's all about getting the price right. There's an externality. We dump carbon into the atmosphere. Nobody pays for that. We've got to put a tax on carbon. That'll get the price right and nothing will go wrong. Now, before I read his work, and I've said 50 years of reading neoclassical economics and Marxian for that matter, and Austrian, this is the worst shit I've ever read. Okay, and he got a Nobel Prize for it. But looking at his perspective is just get the price right, solve the externality. Now, before I realised how bad his work was, my question was, what price of carbon is going to stop us melting Antarctica? That's something so far uncertain you can't rely upon the price mechanism to solve that. So you do have to say, what is the amount of carbon we can pump into the atmosphere? What physical amount of carbon can we cope with before those things start to happen? And work back from the quantity. Don't try to get the price right so the quantity gets worked out by the market. We know the engineering. We know the biomechanics of the planet. We know how much carbon is going to cause a temperature rise. That should have been the set. You should have set the quantity first and work back to a price from that, not vice versa. So they've led us up a garden path again.
Right. So basically what you're saying is that they've adopted the same market, let the market...
Let the market rip.
Yeah.
The market, and this is the, just think about it. Is the market a subset of is the ecology a subset of the market? Or is the market a subset of the ecology?
Yes.
The way they think it's the former.
Yes. So basically everything hangs off the market. And that's, of course, anybody who doesn't actually follow that line of thinking then gets some, no, you're not thinking right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We call Malthusian. I am a proud Malthusian. Nordhaus's nephew said, oh, you're one of these bloody Malthusians. Yes, I am. Because Malthus, even though he got the timing wrong, the basic mathematics is still there. You can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And then if you realise that, you have to constrain how much we consume. And because neoclassical theory makes you a sort of a libertarian anarchist, believing that there should be no controls and the market does everything, you fight against that. So their response to it was to say, oh, well, capitalism can cope with anything, therefore climate change can't be a big issue, therefore we think a 3-degree increase in temperature rise will have impact on the economy of basically zero. Now, that's quoting from a 1994 survey of economists. And so their attitude was, it can't be serious because the market's God.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, the market's not God and it is serious.
Exactly. I had this flash going through my head then. Douglas Adams, a great writer of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and a whole bunch of books. But I remember at one stage he was talking about the fact that this particular planet had sent away hairdressers and a few other...
The Golgafrinchians.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Get them all off the planet, right? And they were on this other planet. The point is, should we round up all economists and just say, no, thank you?
Absolutely. I mean, really, I think one of the best uses for a universal basic income would be to sack all the economists and make sure they don't starve. And like my most recent book, The New Economics and Manifesto, at the end of it, I simply say, we've got to get rid of them. I was once accused of trying to cause a purge. That's true. We need to purge neoclassical economists because there's no chance for economics to reform itself. Once you've got that in your mind, your brain is reorganized to think that way. They can't break out of the paradigm. And this is something which we've seen in physics as well. And Max Planck, when he came up with quantum mechanics, could not convince virtually, of his Maxwellian companions because that's the way they were used to thinking. But what happens in a genuine science is that the students coming in know of the anomaly, like the black body radiation anomaly, or the Michelson-Morley experiment. They know that they can do it themselves in a lab, they can reproduce it, and they've got a professor trying to convince them that this old paradigm can cope. So they nod and take down the notes and pass the exams, but they're off doing the fun stuff in the laboratory. Ultimately, the old bloke retires, they've got to replace it with a new one, and the new one comes in open to the new paradigm. And that's why, to paraphrase Max Planck, he said, science advances one funeral at a time. Well, economics doesn't have that. We have our crises, but they're historic. We can't replay the Great Depression. We can't replay even the Great Recession. So it's one-off. By the time you get on to a few years later, there's another one coming along. You forget the previous one, and you can hang on to enough believers in the paradigm that they continue reproducing themselves and don't die out. So economics should be shut down. We need engineers and biologists and chemists and historians and anthropologists to start developing economics instead and get rid of the neoclassicals.
What about investment bankers?
You used the wrong, so you should use it. Oh, that's a W. If investment bankers actually were in there working out, decent industry, like for one of my old friends, for example, was a mining engineer, became involved in deciding which mines to support in a bank, and that's a good use of that intelligence.
Yeah.
If that was the main way that banks made their money, then you would have intelligent people in investment banking. Instead, it's all about the latest, what do they call the unicorns, et cetera, et cetera. And what you get out of it is herding. And like Richard Vague's brilliant book. Have you read the book?
Yes.
Okay, A Brief History of Doom.
Yes.
Superb piece of writing.
Very good. Recommended.
And what you find in that is that he says, and from his own experience, bankers herd. So rather than getting specialisation and working out what one industry is worthwhile, they all dive into the same one. You get booms and slumps coming out of it. So again, you don't want to let bankers rule everything. And one of my most famous original pieces of work was one where I read Marx. I read everything Marx ever wrote in economics. I wasn't reading him, but working on his section on money. There's a wonderful line where he talks about the roving cavaliers of credit. And this mob know nothing about real production and should have nothing to do with it. And that's the situation. They are investment wankers, not investment bankers.
And of course, what they're doing is basically looking for market advantage and, using volatility to trade and make money off trading, right?
Yeah.
And the question is, how productive is that?
Yeah, it's not. What you get is money turning over in the financial sector and taking forever to come into the real economy.
Yes.
What you want is that money turning over in the real economy and the finance sector providing it. They're great servants and lousy masters, and they call themselves the masters of the universe. Well, that's why the universe is, can I use French? Fucked.
Yep. We'll hope that doesn't get caught by the
by dear, the YouTube algorithm. Oh my God.
And I guess, if I think about the evolution of the finance system, and a lot of really smart people over the years have got sucked into finance and particularly into investment banking, because that's where it all been into IT now. I guess the question I've got is how do we actually tilt playing field so you get smart minds into things like
engineering
real
and
those
stuff,
things.
Yeah. I mean, partly it is having enterprises like Musk's where engineers want to go there and it's very profitable and they can pay decent wages. But in the main, yes, most of the major profits are made in the finance sector. And that's where the good brains have done. I remember one part of it, it's not The Wolf on Wall Street, but it's one of those movies where he said, well, it's not rocket science. He said, actually, he is a rocket scientist, but it pays far better to be in finance. So you want to be able to give decent salaries to people who are using their mathematics, their engineering, their physics for building stuff rather than financial speculation. So that involves reducing the profitability of the finance sector, shrinking it, and then providing enough salary for government researchers, and then setting a base that the private sector has to go above. To get back to the Bell Labs days, that sort of mentality. So engineers get well rewarded and work in an environment which is stimulating for them. They want to go back there again. So Musk has reproduced that to some extent in Tesla and in SpaceX and so on. That's why they're doing so remarkably well. But in the general, it's all the financial engineering that occurs, and that's a waste of a good brain.
Absolutely. And of course, for every winner, there's a loser in those trades, which means that somebody's losing money at the same time as somebody's winning money.
Contracts for difference, and then what you get is embezzlement going on, and again, as Richard talks about the booms and slumps that occur, the herding, and that is just a totally non-creative use of our brains. So we that's why I want to dramatically tame the financial sector. It's far too big, it's far too dominant politically, and it needs to be brought to heel because it's leading us into catastrophes.
So Cookie Boy asked just now, what do you think about forming a national bank? In other words, a bank that's actually owned by the government to invest in the things that we need. I mean, is that part of the story?
That's part of the story. I mean, the Commonwealth Bank used to have that role at the federal level. Equally, you can get things like a State Bank of Victoria that gets caught up in funding Ponzi schemes, so you've got to watch out who gets to be in control of it and so on. But having Hugh Stretton, who used to be, you know the name Hugh Stretton?
I know the name, yes.
Okay, Hugh was involved in housing management in South Australia and did a lot of very good work on economics as well. And he had a very bolshy staff, of course, and there was one dinner where one of the staff said, there should only be public housing. And Hugh said, no, we need them to keep us efficient and they need us to keep them honest. And so if you have a high ethical standard in a bank like that, that's the same sort of role. Have a bank which does things ethically, okay, which tries to provide, which is an objective to try to build the scale of the economy and stop the private ones going totally crazy, and also stop them lending into the housing market. That's got to stop.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting you talk about ethics, because I actually think there is an ethical core missing out of politics, out of finance, actually in many different areas of business at the moment. The profit driver is, kind come hell or high water. And as we discussed earlier, it's squeeze wages as far as you can, make as much profit as you can. How do we tilt the lens more towards this?
I think it's going to be tilted by what's the consequences of being unethical for this length of time.
Right.
We're going to have a crash which affects the upper wealthy if we are forced into, when climate change hits and we have to reduce our consumption levels, then we can't use the yachts of the rich to house the poor. Okay, it's just totally useless stuff, which is there as indulgences right now, as if this can keep on going for 200 years, and it can't. So we're going to realise what we're paid for by thinking we can reduce everything to the profit motive. We have to have ethical standards, and they've been blown out of the water by neoliberalism, by Milton Friedman, by that whole argument, that profitability, shareholder value, all that garbage is absolutely dominant. We need something like the Germans used to have, I think they still have to some extent, the Elferschrak idea, where you have, as well as having a corporate board looking at corporate profits, you've got a board involving stakeholders, which is the local community, the trade unions, your suppliers as well, some of your customers, and that is looking at the overall behaviour of the firm, not just the bottom line. So the American rapacious attitude, that's a large part of why we're up shit creek.
Right. Yes, okay. I knew the creek wasn't looking pretty good, now I know why. Now, I've had a couple of questions in the chat about these large international non-elected entities like the World Economic Forum, and, you could list them, the World Bank, etc., right? Are they part of the problem or are they part of the solution?
It varies from organisation to organisation. For example, the Bank of International Settlements happened to have a damn decent research guy called Bill White, and Bill, I think it was actually around the 2000 crisis, was so disturbed by what happened that he read Hyman Minsky, and then as a result of that was pushing for controls on bank lending and so on. Of course, nothing happened like that, but that meant the BIS is now a great centre for looking at levels of private debt, research on banks lending too much, etc. So it can happen that way. The World Bank is starting to shift internally. They're starting to hire some heterodox economists there, so that's happening as well.
Right.
But the IMF is still absolutely neoliberal, and basically lend and austerity is its policy. The European Union, even though politically it's okay, the whole Maastricht Treaty and what the European Central Bank does. So they vary, generally speaking, because they're staffed by mainstream economists in the main. Yes, they're the problem, but there are some exceptions.
And the concept of you owe nothing and be happy, which has been one of those things that the World Economic Forum has been quoted as saying.
Own nothing and be happy?
Yeah, exactly. So
coming out of those people?
Yeah, so basically saying, in the future you don't need to own stuff, right?
Oh, okay, you rent a car rather than owning a car.
Exactly, right, which is an interesting philosophical spin, and it's quite often seen as...
They'll own the car company.
Yeah, well, probably right, yeah. A lot of people would say, well, they're betraying that idea that there's a sort of a revolution coming in terms of a new financial order, a new financial system, where effectively we're just going to be wage slaves and et cetera, we'll owe nothing.
Well, that's
How much of that do you think is happening now, and do you think there's a truth underlying that, or what?
A certain truth. I mean, I look at the Hunger Games and think that could be the world we end up in.
Yes.
Where there's an incredibly wealthy elite and a mass that are impoverished and kept entertained by blood and circuses. That's a terrifying potential future, but it's one that could happen. So that's why we have to have something which is... I want to see humanity start to regard itself as custodians for life on Earth. That's the only way we're going to survive on this planet.
Yes.
And that's a huge shift from where we are right now. So rather than seeing us as exploiting the planet, we have to see ourselves as being custodians of the planet and custodians of life, and reducing our imposition on the planet dramatically to enable that to happen. So you get people like E.O. Wilson, who argued that we should have 50% of the planet reserved for other species. In other words, that's 50% humans don't go into. If they do, they get dragged out, or they're going there for research purposes, and that's it. Something of that scale to let life continue, because we are destroying life at a rate that has not been seen outside meteor explosions in the past. And
I'm sure you know James Lovelock's work, right?
Yeah.
Because
he's a mathematician too, by the way, not just Lovelock sounds like a touchy-feely. He does some of the best mathematical work on complex systems.
But his point was, you got to understand that if you don't dance with the planet, and if you dance against it,
it'll balance you.
Yeah, exactly right. Which is a very, very important message.
And that's one reason I take climate change so seriously, because we're undermining the capacity to have an industrial civilization on this planet by using too much of the capacity and by not restraining within what's reproducible on the planet. So you have things like the human ecological footprint, which currently says we're using about 1.6, 1.7 times the reproducible load of the planet for our species alone.
Yes.
Okay? We have to get back there, so it's about maybe 0.3, 0.4. Now that's a gigantic fall in our pressure on the planet. We won't do it deliberately, we'll do it by accident.
But the net effect is the same anyway.
Well, I mean, what really troubles me is what we're going to lose in terms of knowledge.
Yes.
Because I do expect an enormous number of deaths of both humans and other life forms over the next century. I'm basically resigned to that. What I don't want to lose is the knowledge we've accumulated. We've learnt so much about the nature of the universe, and it would be tragic to go back into a dark ages after what we've learnt. And so, that's what scares me, to find ourselves back in the sort of Viking type world. When we had the knowledge we have now. And when I see the sort of delusions, the QAnon type things that happen around here, the chance for myth and madness to take over from science is terrifyingly large.
Yeah, and it's worth reflecting on, history. The Romans disappeared pretty much, and there was a dark age, and Egyptians before, but so this isn't the first time that actually we've taken a huge step back.
No, but it's global, and that's the danger. Yeah. There has been some other empire can rise, some other empire can replace the one that's fallen ultimately. So that has happened numerous times. This is the time where we're overloading the entire planet, and what can come out of that? I mean, that's in some ways, I think. And this is one of the dangers. I don't want to see an authoritarian future, but I've got a feeling authoritarian societies are the only ones who are going to be able to impose the controls necessary to maintain something of scale. If you don't have it, you've got small authoritarians. You'll end up in Mad Max. And that to me would be incredibly terrifying, to lose that knowledge, to be back into the sort of brutal world that really existed until about the 1700s when you look around the global. Only after we got this enormous energy from fossil fuels, and we all take the amount of lighting you've got in here for granted. That if you take this back to the 1900s, and you're a king, okay? So individually, yes, a lot of us are poor, and we think we're hard, and it's true we're hard done by in the current circumstances. But if you looked at the level of hot water, okay, turn the stove on. All these sorts of things we take for granted did not exist 200 years ago. Yep. And so we don't realise how much we've taken out of the planet because we've grown. 3% per annum is not very fast, but it doubles every 25 years, the load on the planet. And that's what we've been ignoring.
Now, as we sort of come to the last section of the conversation, I wanted to come back a bit closer to the current economics, right? And observation. The Fed is looking to lift rates quite fast and hard because of their worry about inflation. Yeah. In China, they're cutting rates and growth is going down considerably, right? So it seems to me you've almost got this opposition of two different strategies pulling in two different directions. The two biggest economies in the world, though, are both looking as though growth will be lower next year and the year after than currently. What does that tell us about what's going on?
Well, it shows that we have reached a turning point, and you don't accept the turning point until after it's hit you. China, I think partly what China has done is a very successful grabbing of American technology and then developing of their own domestic technology and a capacity for self-sustaining technological development. America's ignored all that stuff, and that they're now going to have to try to rebuild their industrial sector if you go back for production onshore. So I think we've got, there's a winners and losers situation. Yep. And out of the last 40 years, China is definitely a winner. America is definitely a loser. But of course, you then get all the real politics stuff. The Americans want to be the dominant power on the planet still. So the rivalry they've got with China, at least, the destructive stuff we're seeing in Europe right now between the Europe, that's really an American, European, Russian conflict. But we're going to squabble our way down. We're not going to plan our way down. We're going to squabble our way down.
Right.
And that's what scares us. Out of squabbling will come a complete breakdown. I want to find a way to maintain something as we go down, to have a gradual reduction. China is more likely to work that out than America.
Right. And it's interesting because, of course, there's a big debate about the US dollar and to what extent the US dollar is going to remain the preeminent currency. Of course, there's a great advantage in having the currency that ultimately controls most of the international exchange.
It's also a disadvantage.
Okay.
Because that means your currency is overvalued.
Yep.
Okay. People need your currency not to buy your goods, but because your currency is used for international trade. So your dollar's overvalued, your manufacturing sector declines, and your finance sector rises. Look where we are. So that's what Keynes's idea of a international currency, which is not a national currency. I think like a Bancor, which we would have invented. A large part of that was to avoid that and to not have the same thing. That's what brought England undone. It used to be the dominant empire,
That's right.
with a pound. That's what meant they had no manufacturing sector. What made them great, the Scottish industry, leads only to this decline, where they're a third world manufacturing country these days. So you don't want to have that happen. It's a poison chalice, and I don't want to see any other country take its place. What I'd like to see is something where there's a combination, a weighted combination of currencies at least, something like that for international trade.
Right, but that would be a very different model, right? Deliberately so.
Yeah.
And it would presumably reduce the preeminence of the US and the US dollar in that process.
Yeah, I mean, if that actually did happen, then yes, the US dollar would fall.
Yes.
And the power of the financial sector in America would fall, and that'd be a great tragedy.
Yes.
Mr. Prime Minister. Yeah.
Now, somebody's just asked this, I think it's a good question. Two-party politics, right? We've actually got the situation where in most Western countries we've got some sort of the Westminster system, which is basically one of those and one of those, throwing blocks at each other, a few minor parties spread around. Is that part of the problem too?
I think it's a huge part of the problem. And again, because what you get is conventional wisdom. You get pushed towards the middle. If the middle was based on sensible economics, like we had physiocrats rather than neoclassicals, then that wouldn't have been a bad thing. But we've got this delusion, which is a shared delusion. And what you get is, like in Australia, two parties pushing neoliberal policies.
Yep.
One pushes it and brags about it.
Yes.
The other pushes them and then apologises for them. They're still basically the same policies.
Yep.
And that is a huge weakness. And that's partly where I don't think we've got a political system that grew out of the French Revolution, the gauche and la droite, okay, left and right, two sides of the chamber. That is suited for a tribal world in which the main threat is another tribe, not when the main threat is our own species. We don't. That's why I'm running. I don't want to have juvenile career politicians anymore, people whose main defining feature is a bad case of narcissistic personality disorder. I want people whose main characteristic is a knowledge of engineering, a knowledge of biomechanics, a knowledge of physics, etc., and making decisions in a collective way. We use system software to bring together and see a cohesive, holistic view. That's what we need. We need people who don't want to be elected to get elected. Hello?
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting because this time around there's a greater proportion of undecided people.
Yeah,
than
and
we've had
also
for years,
lots
right?
of independents running as well.
Yeah. So how do you see the role of independents in this sort of,
I want to see lots of independents get elected.
Yes.
One of the dangers I see, and this is one reason that I'm in a party rather than standing as an independent, is that this whole idea that independents should not tell you what your preference is going to be. Now, some Australians understand the preferential system, but a lot don't.
Yeah.
And what I'm afraid will happen is that people who are rightly disgusted by the Liberal Party, because it's become, it's not liberal, it's reactionary. That's why TNL began with the word liberal. Reactionary, Pentecostal, climate change denialists. Okay, that's the party. So people who are progressive, who used to vote Liberal all the time, at least I can vote for an independent and I'll put Liberal second. And what scares me is that if the independent gets more votes than Liberal, no problem. But if the independent gets less votes than Liberal, they become a Trojan horse for the Liberal Party itself. So one thing I hope it doesn't happen. I want to see a landslide that wipes Morrison out completely. But what scares me is that those, what they call the teal independents, the non-party independents, who are often smaller Liberals themselves, not directing preferences, people won't know that if they want to make sure that they get rid of the reactionary party, which is what the Liberals are, you've got to put them last. Okay, you can't go independent, Liberal, Labor, okay, which a lot of these people will do. So that's why I'm annoyed they're not directing preferences, and it's that one reason I'm in a party that says we want you to put the Liberal Party last. And then a Senate ballot paper, they won't even turn up in our preferences. Okay, so we want to give all the minority parties. So the real fear, I would hate to see Morrison having another miracle, where the miracle is caused by the Teal campaigns.
And so you've got a how to vote guide on your website, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're still putting ours together, but the universal rule is Liberal Party last.
Yes.
That even means putting Paul and Hanson ahead of the Liberal Party. Yeah? Okay, they put them right at the very bottom, so there's absolutely no chance there'll be leakage of votes to them. People have to do that in the House of Reps, otherwise they could win. In the Senate, the rule in the Senate now is you must vote for either 6 parties or 12 independents, and there's 23 parties. We almost got position 1 for TNL. I'm position 2. I'm column B. Vote column B. and so we want to say, we give a whole lot of. We're putting the Greens in there. Okay, they're one of our 6, and that's whether the Greens have a deal with us or not. We're putting the Greens in there because we want our vote to go to that party rather than Labor or Liberal. Okay, so people would just please, even if you can't bring yourself to vote for my party, TNL first. Or even if you vote for Liberal, I hate the thought, but even if you do, there's going to be some of their preferences that don't get allocated to their own people. They won't get 3 seats. So if you're so bolted on that you can't not vote Liberal, even with Morrison, even after the garbage he's been through, put TNL as one of your 6. That will work. So, but in terms of our own preferences, saying TNL first, we're discussing which party goes second. Greens in there for sure. Parties like Fusion are a possibility. It's still got to be drafted properly by the party. But the small progressive independent parties are the ones we're saying vote for.
And it's really, really important to underscore, you need to understand how this preference system works, right? Because otherwise, you just rightly say, you can absolutely make a mistake in terms of your ordering and not get the result that you want.
Well, my mother, God bless her soul, you met her a few years ago. She was so disgusted by the children overboard and by the invasion of Afghanistan. She went on the first ever political demonstration with me to demonstrate against the war in Iraq. And she asked me, how do I not vote Liberal? And I said, Mum, you've got to put Labor ahead of Liberal. I said, you can vote for a small party. The Labor Party has to come ahead of the Liberal Party. That was changing a lifelong pattern for her. It was really emotionally hard for her to do it, and I understand people who feel like that. But even people who see themselves as aligned with what they see as Liberal Party philosophy, you've got a bunch of cuckoos running that thing, okay? You think you've got, you haven't got your favourite robins there. You've been taken over by another mob. You've got to get rid of them. And the only way to get rid of them is they've got to be last.
And just sort of continuing that theme, the interest rates went up today. They're going to go up further. So we've got high inflation, we've got interest rates going up, we've got wages not growing, we've got cost of living rising. Great economic managers?
They never have been.
No.
And this is the trouble. This is what we might remember back in the last election. I said it's going to be a hospital pass.
It'd
be better if you like the Labor Party, let the Liberals vote for the Liberals so that they'll walk into the catastrophe. Well, the catastrophes came late in the scene, and we've seen how badly they've handled it. So in that sense, I was right about that little guess. They didn't quite have the form that I expected, but but the trouble is, they've been so appallingly bad. Morrison doesn't hold a hose. All he does is cosplay, and then he says he's a great leader. Help us. So I want to see the end of him. And the only way to make sure we see the end of him, if you're disgusted by his behaviour, how that whole Pentecostal right-wing bunch of nongs have taken over the Liberal Party, even if you believe in the Liberal Party, you've got to put them last this election.
Right. And the other thing I wanted to highlight, they keep talking about their economic plan. Right?
Yeah. There ain't no plan.
No.
If you look at the country in detail, and this turns up on my policy page on a resilient economy as well. If you go back to 1995, Australia was ranked about number 65 in the world in terms of the complexity of goods that it could produce. Now we're about 110. Okay, Cambodia was about 110. It's now 66. So Cambodia has actually made its economy capable of producing more sophisticated goods. We've gone in the wrong direction. That's not a plan, that's an accident. And so their only plan has been to exploit fossil fuels. Now, what happens when we get to the point somebody says, that's it, and I mean somebody meaning everybody on the planet, we have a catastrophe nobody can deny has been caused by climate change, and therefore we have to stop now with carbon-based industries. And we're opening 120 or 140 new coal mines.
That's right.
You know, we are building stuff which is bound to be shut down at some point. That's not a plan, that's an accident.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the other point there is that there are significant flows of money going from the resource sector to particularly the conservative side of government.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
And people moving from government to private sector jobs and all that sort of stuff.
Incredible corruption.
Yeah.
A major thing, not just having an ICAC with teeth, but also I want to stop completely private funding of elections. We have a system right now which is pretty good in Australia, that once you get past 4% of the vote, and that's like a major target I've got is to get at least 4% of the primary vote. I want 14.5% of the total, but 4% of the primary, because under Australian electoral rules, you therefore get basically $3 per vote. Now, that would give us the money to be able to run a decent campaign for 2025. But that's not a bad screen. We should be giving not $3 a vote, but $15 or $20 a vote. And that should be the source of revenue for parties, not 1 cent from the private sector. And break down that link, because at the moment we have the worst politicians money can buy.
Literally. Yes. No, that's good. Well, look, we're nearly running out of time. Is there anything else you'd like to table or talk about before we get to the end of our time?
I'll push my Minsky software, just in terms of I'm trying to build an alternative paradigm for economics, and that needs an alternative tool. We've got to get away from thinking about the economy like this. We've got to think it in a dynamic sense. So that's what I've done with Minsky software. It's something which, if people are puzzled about what's all this stuff about government money creation and bank money creation, I have on my website, theprofstevekeen.com, a Minsky page. You can download it there, and I've got a manual. And there's one section called Minsky for Dummies, okay? And the basic size, here's how to use the accounting side of it to work out how government finances actually work. Now, if you do that, you'll find that it's the opposite of what you think. Governments don't actually borrow, okay? Governments create money. Why do you borrow when you can create it? And we should have more government money creation. We need to have a deficit. All this scare about government debt is completely wrong-headed. It's like Salem witch hunt type stuff, afraid of witches. Get away from it, because that's a huge source of the stupidity and the dumbing down of politics over time.
But isn't it also important to understand that, sure, you can run a deficit, but you've got to put the money in the right things?
Oh, yeah, as well. Yeah, right? Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I want a deficit to finance decent education. I want free education, which is hard to get into.
Yes.
Okay? And I want to have well-paid academics who aren't pushed around by pen pushers. I want to have less bureaucrats. I want less bureaucrats on top of academics and more beneath them, that sort of thing. So I want to get CSIRO properly funded. I want decent research being done. I want scientists being happy to go to work rather than pissed off of having to go put research applications in and get bugger all work done and end up outsourcing stuff to the private sector. So all that sort of stuff. There are things which the government is much better at doing than the private sector. Things which can lose money. Okay, insurance, health, education, welfare. You need a decent government sector and not be afraid of running a deficit to do that. And the deficit creates the money for the private sector to turn over. We need that mentality back. Get rid of this deficit scare garbage.
And as we come to the end of the show, people are asking, what's your thoughts on interest rates? Are they going to go up more?
They'll go up more several times, I think, because at the moment inflation rates, about 6%. The interest rates, half a percent, or not even 0.5%. So they will continue putting the rates up for quite some time. But they did the same thing in 2010. Because after the financial crisis, they thought Australia avoided it, and the Reserve Bank was the last one to stop raising rates before the crisis, and the first one to start afterwards, and in both cases was forced back to go back down again. So third time around, it'll happen again. They'll put rates up, the economy will tank more than they think, and they'll be forced to reverse them once more. But of course, the trigger is going to be, oh my God, we've got falling house prices, can't have that.
No, indeed. Well, you've said over the years, house prices were going to fall, they didn't. I've been saying house prices are overvalued, they will fall, they haven't yet.
Yeah.
TFF version 2, more migration, RBA basically buying bad loans off the banks.
Yeah.
You can see it all there, can't you?
Oh, every last policy's that's supposed to have been about making housing more affordable has been the real effect has been to make housing more expensive.
Yeah.
We've got the same thing again now. And what you've got to think, I saw it happening and I thought the only way this is going to stop is when a majority of the population can no longer afford to buy a house.
Yep.
Now what they're doing instead, we'll pay 40%. I mean, it's reducing, the Japanese did the same thing, and you got to the point before the 1990 crash there of 99-year mortgages.
Yep.
And we're doing the same sort of stupidity.
Intergenerational mortgages, which is turning people into cash flows. They'll go on paying through their whole of their life and beyond. Of course, the banks will love it.
Oh, what you get is the finance sector takes over everything.
Yeah.
The roving cavaliers of credit win.
Yeah.
They've got to lose. The only way to have a decent society is put those bastards back in the box.
Steve, I want to say thank you very much for a great conversation, a very frank conversation. Thank you for that. Very appreciative in the comments as well. A few people asking a load of questions I haven't been able to get to, but really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. And I'm sure we're going to have another conversation, I think, in a couple of weeks with Vixer, I think, as well.
And I may be in America at that stage having a conversation with another podcaster, Lex Friedman.
Could be very interesting.
I'll call that. It's the 17th, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's 2 weeks' time. So yeah.
Okay, well, I might be in a Tesla hailing down between Gigafactory, Giga Texas, and Starbase, but let's see what we can manage.
Sounds pretty good. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to take you offline and then going to go back and just close the show. So
thank you.
Thank you. Hope you enjoyed that. I certainly had fun talking to Steve. He's always a breath of fresh air, but also raises a whole bunch of very, very interesting and important questions. And, the bottom line is this. There is an opportunity in this election to do something very different, and that is to shake things up and start a new trajectory. And I think you've heard tonight why that's important. Well, next week, we're going to have Leith Van Onselen on the show, and we're going to explore, again, some of the economics around the election and his perspective, particularly on housing and some of the things there. So mark your diaries and come and join us again next week for a great conversation with Leith. He's always worth conversation time. And I would say, please, if you haven't liked the show, please like the show, because it's a really, really important thing to do to spread the word. Thank you very much indeed for spending some of your Tuesday evening with us. And I'll look forward to seeing you all again next time, or catch up on our recorded shows meantime. So this is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.